Welcome, special soul. Tonight the topic we will be falling asleep to is about one of Europe's deadliest plagues, the Black Death. Before we begin, I just wanted to say thank you for joining, and I hope your thoughts start to slow and you start to rest. Also, comment down below what time it is where you live. Now let's get started. Welcome to a different kind of journey through history, one that asks us to walk gently through shadow as well as light, to witness human suffering with compassion rather than fear, and to discover how ordinary people faced the unimaginable with courage, faith, and the quiet resilience that has sustained humanity through its darkest hours. Tonight, we step into the year 1347, when ships arrived in European harbours carrying cargo that would transform the medieval world forever. Not spices or silk, but invisible passengers that would claim the lives of millions and reshape civilization itself. This is the story of the Black Death, the plague that swept across Europe like a dark tide, but told not through statistics and dates, but through the lived experiences of the people who endured it. Picture a European town in the autumn of 1347, a peaceful place where merchants call their wares in cobblestone streets, where church bells mark the gentle rhythm of daily prayers, where families gather for evening meals in homes that have sheltered generations. The air carries the familiar sense of wood smoke and baking bread, the sounds of children playing and neighbours greeting each other with the comfortable intimacy of communities where everyone knows everyone else's name. Within months, this peaceful scene will transform into something that medieval people could never have imagined in their darkest nightmares. Streets will empty of life. Churches will overflow with the dying and dead. Families will be torn apart not by choice, but by the simple mathematics of contagion. The very air will seem poisoned by an invisible enemy that no prayer, no medicine, no amount of careful living could protect against. Yet this is not simply a story of death and despair. It is also a story of how human beings respond when faced with circumstances that shatter every assumption about how the world should work. We will discover acts of extraordinary courage alongside moments of desperate selfishness, profound faith coexisting with existential doubt, communities that held together against impossible odds, and others that fractured under the weight of unimaginable loss. In the coming chapters, we will walk slowly through the experience of plague, not rushing past the horror, but sitting gently with it, understanding it, finding in these dark events the eternal truths about human nature that reveal themselves most clearly in times of crisis. We will meet physicians who treated patients knowing they were likely signing their own death warrants, priests who performed last rites until they themselves fell ill, parents who made impossible choices about which children to care for and which to abandon to fate. We will witness how people tried to make sense of the incomprehensible, the religious explanations they offered, the medical theories they constructed, the scapegoats they found when rational explanation failed. We will see how some communities responded with compassion and mutual aid, while others descended into violence and paranoia. We will understand how the plague transformed not just the demographic map of Europe, but its social structures, economic systems, religious beliefs, and cultural outlook. But we will also discover something unexpected, how even in the midst of overwhelming death, life found ways to continue. How survivors created new families, new communities, new ways of understanding their place in a world that had revealed its fundamental unpredictability. how the plague, despite its horror, opened possibilities for social change that had been unthinkable before, peasants demanding better treatment, women finding new roles, entire systems of power being questioned and reshaped. This journey requires something from us as listeners, the willingness to sit with uncomfortable truths, to witness suffering without turning away, to find meaning in stories that don't offer easy answers or happy endings. We approach these dark chapters of history not with morbid fascination, but with the reverence they deserve, understanding that the people who lived through the plague were as complex, as hopeful, as fully human as we are, facing challenges we can barely imagine with resources we might consider inadequate. Picture a plague doctor in his strange beaked mask, walking through streets where the only sound is the creaking of death carts and the desperate prayers of those who still have strength to hope. Inside that unsettling costume is simply a person, someone who chose to face danger rather than flee, who believed that medical knowledge, however limited, was worth offering even when success seemed impossible. Picture a mother sitting beside a child marked with the unmistakable signs of plague, the swollen buboes, the fever that burns like fire, the delirium that steals away the personality of the child she loves. She knows the statistics. She understands that survival is unlikely. Yet she stays, offering comfort, singing the lullabies that have soothed this child since infancy, choosing love over safety in the eternal human conviction that presence matters even when we cannot change outcomes. Picture a priest standing in a cemetery where fresh graves outnumber the living, performing burial rites for the hundreds of dead, knowing that his faith is being tested in ways that centuries of theology never prepared him for. His voice, hoarse from constant prayer, still rises in the ancient words that promise meaning beyond mortality, hope beyond horror, redemption beyond the apparent randomness of suffering. These are the stories we will explore together, not to frighten or disturb, but to understand, to honour, and to discover what these experiences from 6 centuries ago can teach us about resilience, community, faith, and the remarkable capacity of human beings to endure what seems unendurable, and to find, even in the darkest valleys, reasons to continue, to hope, and eventually to rebuild. We will move through this material slowly and gently, pausing when needed, approaching each chapter with the respect it deserves. The Black Death was not simply an historical event to be studied. It was lived experience for millions of people whose names we will never know, but whose suffering, courage, and humanity deserve to be remembered and honoured. So settle in comfortably and prepare for a journey that will take us to places both dark and ultimately illuminating, where we will discover that even in humanity's most desperate hours, the human spirit finds ways not just to survive but to maintain dignity, to express love, and to create meaning from circumstances that seem designed to destroy it. Now we stand on the docks of a Mediterranean port in October 1347, where merchant ships are arriving with cargo that will transform Europe forever, though no one watching their arrival can yet imagine what invisible passengers travel in the holds below. Picture the bustling harbour of Messina, Sicily, on an autumn morning when the air still carries summer's warmth and the sea sparkles with Mediterranean light. Sailors call to each other in multiple languages as ships from the east tie up at wooden docks worn smooth by centuries of trade. Merchants gather eagerly, anticipating the silks and spices, the precious goods that have travelled thousands of miles along trade routes connecting Europe to the distant markets of Asia. The ships themselves look ordinary enough trading vessels that have made this journey countless times before, their holds filled with the exotic luxuries that European wealth demands and Eastern markets provide. Yet something about this arrival feels different to those with eyes to see. The crews seem depleted, their numbers smaller than expected. Some sailors move with the uncertain gait of illness, while others lie motionless on deck, too weak to rise for the work of docking. In the soft morning light, imagine the scene unfolding at the docks as the first cargo is unloaded. Strong backs lift bales and barrels, while merchants inspect goods that have survived the long sea journey. No one notices the other passengers disembarking the black rats that scurry down mooring ropes with the confident familiarity of creatures who have made countless similar journeys, and the even smaller travellers they carry. Fleas infected with a bacterium called Yersinia pestis that will soon have a different name in the terrified whispers of dying populations, the Black Death. These rats, Rattus, the black ship rat, were so common in medieval ports that their presence attracted no attention whatsoever. Picture them moving through the chaos of the docks with the purposeful efficiency of animals seeking food and shelter. They slip into warehouses where grain is stored, scurry along streets toward the warm interiors of homes and shops, infiltrate granaries and food stores where they can live undisturbed among the abundance that human civilization provides. The fleas they carry are equally unremarkable, tiny parasites that medieval people understood as common nuisances, irritating but not dangerous. Picture these microscopic creatures, their bodies filled with bacteria so concentrated that their digestive systems are blocked, causing them to feed repeatedly in desperate attempts to satisfy hunger that can never be relieved. Each bite injects plague bacteria directly into the bloodstream of whatever warm-blooded host they find, rat or human. It makes no difference to organisms that exist only to replicate and spread. For several days, perhaps even weeks, life in Messina continues with only subtle signs that something unprecedented is beginning. A few dock workers fall ill with mysterious symptoms, sudden fever, terrible weakness, swellings in their necks and groins that grow with alarming speed. Perhaps some recover, perhaps others die quickly. In a medieval city where illness and death are common enough occurrences, these early cases might not immediately signal the catastrophe that is already spreading through the population like ripples from a stone cast into still water. Picture a physician in Messina, perhaps in late October, being called to examine a patient with symptoms he has never encountered before. The sick man lies on his bed, burning with fever that seems to consume him from within. His eyes are glassy with pain and confusion, his breath comes in laboured gasps, and most alarming of all, enormous swellings have appeared at his neck, armpits, and groin. Buboes that give the bubonic plague its name, lumps as large as eggs or even apples, dark and painful and terrifying in their sudden appearance. The physician, trained in the medical theories of ancient Greece and medieval Islam, tries to understand these symptoms within the framework of knowledge he possesses. Perhaps the patient's humours are imbalanced, requiring bloodletting to restore proper equilibrium. Perhaps the air itself has become corrupted. The theory of miasma that explained disease as arising from bad air seems to fit with the foul smell that accompanies the illness. He prescribes treatments that have worked for other ailments, herbal remedies, changes in diet, prayers to patron saints known for their healing intercession. But the patient dies anyway, often within days of the first symptoms appearing, and worse, far worse, the physician notices that others are falling ill with the same distinctive signs. The dock worker's family, the neighbours who helped care for him, other patients the physician has treated. A pattern is emerging that fills him with a dread he cannot yet articulate. This illness spreads from person to person with a relentlessness that suggests something unprecedented is happening. Within weeks of those first ships' arrival, Messina transforms from a thriving port city into a charnel house where death walks openly through streets that empty of life with shocking speed. Picture families barricading themselves in their homes, desperate to avoid contact with the invisible contagion. Shops close, markets empty. The normal bustle of urban life grinds to a halt as people understand, with growing horror, that proximity to others means probable death. What shocks medieval observers most profoundly is not just that people are dying. Death is familiar enough in a world where infant mortality is high and lifespans are short, but the speed and scale of the dying. Picture a street in Messina in November 1347, just weeks after those merchant ships arrived. Houses that were full of life now stand silent, their inhabitants dead or fled. The air carries the sweet, sickening smell of decomposition as bodies lie unburied because there are no longer enough healthy people to perform the most basic obligations to the dead. The mortality moves through households with terrifying efficiency. A father falls ill on Monday. By Wednesday, his wife and children show symptoms. By the following Monday, the entire family lies dead while neighbours, too frightened to offer help, maintain desperate distance. Picture the psychological impact of watching this pattern repeat, house by house, street by street, until the very concept of community care, the mutual aid that has always sustained human societies, crumbles under the weight of survival instinct. Those who can flee do so, abandoning homes, businesses, even sick family members in desperate attempts to escape the invisible death that seems to lurk in every breath of air, every touch, every moment of human contact. Picture the roads leading out of Messina clogged with refugees carrying whatever possessions they can manage, their faces showing the particular terror that comes from fleeing an enemy you cannot see, cannot fight, and cannot escape through any action you understand. But the fleeing only spreads the contagion further. These refugees carry plague to the countryside, to other towns, to regions that might have remained untouched if the infected had stayed isolated in the original port. Like ripples expanding from multiple stones cast into water, the plague begins to spread across Sicily, then to the Italian mainland, then north and west across the trade routes that connect medieval Europe in a network that will now carry death as efficiently as it once carried commerce. As autumn turns to winter and then to spring, the plague spreads beyond cities into the rural countryside where most medieval Europeans live. Picture a small village in southern France, perhaps in early 1348, a collection of modest cottages clustered around a stone church, surrounded by the fields that have sustained this community for generations. Life here follows ancient rhythms, the agricultural calendar, religious festivals, births and marriages and deaths that connect families across generations. The plague arrives perhaps with a traveller or a merchant who survived long enough to reach this village before succumbing to symptoms. Or perhaps it comes with the rats themselves, migrating from town to countryside as urban populations collapse. However it arrives, the result is the same. Within weeks, this village that has existed for centuries begins to die. Picture the horror of watching your entire world disappear. The smith who has shod the village's horses for 30 years falls ill and dies. The miller whose family has operated the village mill for 5 generations succumbs with his wife and children. The priest who has baptized, married and buried 3 generations of villagers lies in his church, too weak to perform the last rites for parishioners who die faster than he can reach them. The children, especially vulnerable to the plague's ravages, die in numbers that break their parents' hearts and souls. Picture a mother who has borne 6 children, watching as 4 of them sicken and die within a single week, their small bodies burning with fever while the terrible buboes appear like marks of divine punishment. She survives. Some 30 to 40% of those infected do survive, though no one understands why some live while others die. But survival means living with losses that no amount of medieval faith's promise of heavenly reunion can fully reconcile. When we speak of villages vanishing, we mean this literally. Picture a place that in January 1348 housed perhaps 100 people, a viable community with farmers, craftsmen, a priest, families who have intermarried for generations, creating the dense web of relationships that makes a collection of houses into a true community. By summer of that same year, perhaps 10 people remain alive, perhaps 5, perhaps none at all. The survivors, too few to maintain the community's functions, abandon the village entirely, seeking safety in numbers by joining other settlements or fleeing to towns where they hope, usually wrongly, that organised medical care or religious intervention might offer better chances of survival. The empty cottages, their hearths cold, their doors swinging open to wind and weather, stand as silent testimony to lives that ended too quickly, and communities that dissolved like morning mist under the plague's relentless advance. Picture these ghost villages scattered across the European countryside, fields returning to wilderness, carefully tended gardens choked with weeds, livestock wandering untended until they too die or go feral. Archaeological evidence has revealed hundreds of such settlements, places where the careful work of generations to create sustainable communities came to abrupt ends in the spring and summer of 1348. In some places, travellers in later years reported finding entire villages of corpses, the dead lying where they fell because no one remained alive to bury them. Picture the profound silence of such places. No children's laughter, no animals lowing, no church bells marking the hours, just the wind moving through empty streets and the slow work of nature reclaiming human spaces. The mechanism of the plague's spread follows the roots of medieval commerce with remorseless efficiency. Picture the network of trade that connects medieval Europe. Merchant ships moving between ports, wagon trains carrying goods along established roads, pilgrims travelling to holy sites, soldiers moving to distant wars, all creating pathways along which the plague travels as efficiently as the goods and people that have always moved along these routes. From Messina, the plague moves to Genoa, to Venice, to Marseille, the great port cities that serve as gateways between Mediterranean trade and European hinterlands. From these ports, it spreads inland along river valleys and trade roads, following the Rhone Valley into France, moving up the Italian peninsula toward Florence and Rome, crossing to North Africa, where cities experience the same devastating mortality as their European counterparts. By spring 1348, the plague has reached Paris and London, the great capital cities of medieval Europe. Picture the psychological impact of watching death arrive in cities that represent the pinnacles of medieval civilization. Places with universities and cathedrals, with royal courts and accumulated wealth, with all the resources that medieval society can marshal. Yet none of it matters. The plague kills with democratic efficiency. Rich and poor, powerful and powerless, learned and ignorant, all fall to an enemy that respects no earthly hierarchy. Perhaps the most profound aspect of the plague's arrival is how it shattered medieval people's fundamental assumptions about how the world worked. Picture a society whose worldview is deeply religious, where events are understood as reflections of divine will or cosmic order, where suffering is supposed to have meaning and follow patterns that human understanding can grasp. The plague fits none of these categories. Its victims seem randomly selected. Why does one family member survive while others die? Why do some villages suffer total extinction, while others, seemingly similar in every way, escape with modest losses? The righteous die alongside the sinful. Prayers offered with desperate faith seem no more effective than panicked flight. Physicians armed with the best medical knowledge of their age prove as helpless as the illiterate peasants they attempt to treat. Picture the cognitive dissonance this creates, the struggle to maintain faith in a benevolent God while watching innocents die in numbers that suggest either divine abandonment or divine cruelty. The attempts to find explanation and meaning, to impose order on chaos, to believe that human understanding and action can somehow regain control over circumstances that seem to have escaped all comprehension and intervention. And so death arrived in Europe in the autumn of 1347, carried on merchant ships that docked at familiar harbours, spread by invisible creatures that medieval science had no way to understand, moving with a speed and efficiency that transformed the known world within months. Entire villages vanished. Cities saw half their populations die. The very fabric of medieval society began to unravel under the weight of mortality beyond anything human civilization had previously experienced. The year is 1348. You live in a small town tucked behind stone walls, a place where life has always been predictable. People work the fields, shop in the markets, attend church, and gather in taverns. But now that rhythm is broken. Fear has become the rhythm. Each morning you wake to silence until the bells begin. They toll, not to call the faithful to prayer, but to mark another death, then another, then another. The bells echo through the town until the sound becomes part of the air itself. You know, before you even rise from your bed, that the plague has claimed more lives. No one understands what is happening. There are no doctors as we imagine them today, only learned men and priests, each with their own explanations. Some say God has sent this punishment for the greed, pride, and sins of humanity. The sermons thunder with warnings, repent or perish. Others whisper of distant lands, of poisoned wells, of wandering strangers accused of bringing the pestilence. Still others turn their eyes to the stars, insisting the heavens themselves have aligned in a pattern of doom. And so fear begins to shape behaviour. Families stuff their windows with rags soaked in vinegar, hoping to keep out the bad air. Herbal pouches filled with lavender, rosemary or garlic are tied to belts, or worn around the neck, the scent sharp and overwhelming. Streets are filled with the smoke of burning herbs, the crackle of fires meant to drive away unseen poison. But none of it works. People still sicken. They still die. The signs of illness are impossible to ignore. First, a fever. Then weakness so deep the body can barely rise. Buboes, swollen lumps under the arms, and groin swell black and painful. Sometimes the victim coughs blood, and when that happens, the end comes quickly. Everyone has seen it. Everyone knows the progression, and that knowledge is its own terror. Parents eye their children anxiously. Children stare at their parents afraid. Some families lock themselves inside their homes, refusing to open the door to neighbours or even to priests. Others run, leaving towns for the countryside only to find that the plague travels with them. The fear is inescapable. Friendship itself begins to collapse. The familiar bonds that once held communities together start to fray. A cough in the marketplace empties the stalls. Neighbours no longer visit one another. The sick are sometimes left alone to die, their cries echoing from behind closed shutters. People begin to believe that even touching a loved one could mean death within days. And yet, even while fear divides, it also unites. In some towns, processions of the faithful walk the streets barefoot, chanting prayers and begging God for mercy. The crack of whips echoes through the alleys as flagellants, men who whip themselves, bloody march from city to city, believing their suffering might cleanse the world of sin. They draw crowds of desperate people who fall to their knees, hoping that sacrifice and prayer can turn the tide. But the plague does not stop. The fear grows darker still. Rumours spread faster than the disease itself. Whispers accuse outsiders, travellers, and entire communities of poisoning wells or bringing curses. In some towns, violence erupts against the accused. The plague has not only taken lives, it has taken trust, compassion, and the fragile sense of safety that held society together. Imagine lying in your bed at night. The streets are quiet, save for the occasional sound of wheels creaking as a cart rolls past a cart carrying the dead. Sometimes voices call out, "Bring out your dead." The words carried through the dark freeze your heart. You think of your family. You think of your neighbours. You wonder if tomorrow the cart will stop at your door. This is what it meant to live in fear during the Black Death. It was not only the sickness itself that consumed people, but the dread that lingered in every breath, every sound, every silence. The world felt cursed, fragile, and unpredictable, as though life itself could vanish without warning. And so, survival was not just about escaping the plague. It was about living day after day in a shadow of dread, never knowing if you would see another sunrise. It is said that the plague travelled on ships, tucked into the fur of rats, carried by the bite of unseen fleas. But in the Middle Ages, no one knew this. To those living in the 14th century, the plague simply appeared, like a shadow moving across the land. The first rumours arrived quietly. Traders returning from the east spoke of strange diseases sweeping through caravans and ports. Stories of entire towns emptied of life, of ships adrift with no crew left alive to steer them. At first, these tales seemed distant, the kind of dark gossip that travellers often carried. But then the ports of Europe began to see those ships for themselves. In 1347, a fleet of Genoese ships limped into the harbour of Messina in Sicily. What the townspeople saw was horrifying. The sailors staggered off the decks with blackened swellings under their arms, with blood on their lips, with fevers that burned through their strength in days. Many never made it ashore before collapsing, The people of Messina, terrified, drove the ships away, but it was too late. The sickness was already there, carried into the streets and alleyways, spreading with a speed no one could understand. From Sicily, the plague rode the trade routes like a silent passenger. It reached Italy, France, Spain, and then the great ports of England. Every ship was a risk. Every traveller could carry death. Imagine being a villager in a small English town in 1348. At first, it is only whispers a market trader has fallen ill after returning from the coast. A monk in the abbey collapses during Mass. A wealthy merchant's household is suddenly shuttered, the family vanishing from sight. Soon the whispers become cries. The cart that carried grain into town now carries bodies out. The arrival of plague is swift and merciless. It does not trickle in quiet. It strikes like a storm. Within weeks of its first appearance, entire streets fall silent. A family that was laughing as a socket one day is gone the next. Children disappear from the lanes where they once played. The graveyards begin to fill, and the grave diggers themselves fall sick, leaving the dead unburied for days. The church bells toll so often that they begin to lose their meaning. The solemn sound of mourning becomes background noise, a constant reminder that death is no longer exceptional, it is ordinary. In some places the bells stop altogether. There are simply too many deaths to mark. The fear that spreads with the plague is almost as powerful as the disease itself. Towns slam their gates shut, forbidding travellers from entering. Villages refuse to trade with their neighbours. Some towns burn pitch or tar in the streets, believing that thick smoke will cleanse the air. Priests lead prayers that echo through the night, voices breaking with desperation. And yet, nothing works. The plague ignores gates, prayers, and smoke. It spreads along roads, across fields, through families, striking both rich and poor. In castles, lords watch as their servants fall. In huts, peasants watch as their families collapse. No one is safe. This suddenness of the plague's arrival is what makes it so devastating. Life before had been predictable, even if it was harsh. People knew the rhythm of the seasons, the hardship of harvest, the hunger of winter. But the plague shattered that rhythm. Death could appear in a household in the morning and claim it by nightfall. Some chronicles describe the arrival of the plague in haunting detail. In Florence, the writer Giovanni Boccaccio recalled how neighbours avoided one another, how parents abandoned children, how entire houses were left empty as their occupants perished within days. In England, monks recorded that the sickness moved with such speed that priests could not give last rites to all who needed them, and as the plague arrived, it carried with it a heavy, unshakable truth that the world had changed, that the old order of safety in family, of comfort in community, of guidance from the church could no longer protect anyone. The plague was not just a sickness. It was a force that defied every explanation, a darkness that no one could stop. To witness its arrival was to feel the ground shift beneath you, to see neighbours fall, markets close, and roads emptied of life, to realise that the future you had imagined, the harvest you had planned, the children you had raised, the prayers you had whispered might never come to pass. This was how the plague arrived. Not quietly, not slowly, but like a shadow that swallowed towns whole, leaving fear, silence, and grief in its wake. When the plague swept across Europe, it was not only death that travelled with it, but confusion. People knew sickness, of course. They had lived through fevers, leprosy, and famines, but nothing like this. The plague was faster, more merciless, and it seemed to strike without reason. A wealthy merchant could die as quickly as a beggar in the streets. A nun who had lived her life in quiet prayer might collapse the same way as a soldier returning from war. And so, people searched desperately for answers. The most common belief was that the air itself had turned poisonous. Doctors and scholars spoke of miasma, a corrupted, toxic atmosphere filled with invisible vapours. If you breathed it in, death would soon follow. In towns, bonfires were lit to cleanse the air. Barrels of herbs were burned in marketplaces, filling the streets with the smell of rosemary, juniper, and pine resin. The smoke clung to clothes, hair, and walls, but it did nothing to stop the sickness. Still, people believed, for it was all they had. Others turned to more practical, if brutal, methods. Some physicians instructed their patients to carry sweet-smelling posies, small bundles of herbs and flowers pressed close to their faces to ward off the stench of death. People stuffed lavender and thyme into their pockets, hung garlic above their doors, and wore pomanders, small balls filled with spices, around their necks. Even plague doctors, with their now famous bird-like masks, carried strong herbs and vinegar inside the beak, believing it would purify each breath. But beyond herbs and smoke, the remedies grew darker. Bloodletting, an ancient practice, was revived with grim determination. Physicians would open veins or apply leeches, convinced that draining corrupted blood might save the healthy. Many who were already weak from fever died faster under the knife. Others were advised to avoid bathing, for some believed that hot water opened the pores and let the poison seep in. In contrast, another school of thought insisted that frequent bathing in vinegar could wash away the disease. Superstitions flourished. Some carried charms made of written prayers, folded and tied against their skin. Others turned to astrology, blaming the alignment of planets for the foul outbreak. Charts and star maps were drawn up, and remedies were prescribed according to the movement of celestial bodies. But the plague cared little for the stars. There were also stranger, desperate cures. In some regions, people drank potions of crushed emerald or ground gold, hoping that rare and precious substances held divine power. Others placed live hens against their swollen sores, believing the birds could draw out the poison. The hens often died, and so did their owners. Communities, desperate to protect themselves, turned inward. Some towns closed their gates entirely, refusing entry to strangers. Villages blocked roads with carts and stones, driving away travellers at spear point. Those who could fled to the countryside, abandoning homes in hopes of finding cleaner, safer air. But isolation was no guarantee. The plague travelled silently, and often it was already among them. In monasteries, monks copied prayers and psalms by candlelight, their ink-stained fingers trembling as they asked for God's mercy. Processions wound through cities, barefoot penitents whipping their backs bloody in hopes of divine forgiveness. People whispered that the plague was punishment for greed, for pride, for sin. Whole communities fell into grief and guilt, believing their suffering had been written by the hand of God. And yet, despite all efforts, nothing worked. Herbs, smoke, bloodletting, prayers, and stars all failed. Families who tried everything still lost their loved ones. Villages that barred their gates still heard the coughs and cries of sickness echoing through their lanes. Monks who wrote their prayers still collapsed over their ink-stained pages. The attempts at cures and protections reveal something profound. Not just fear, but hope. Even when faced with death beyond comprehension, people clung to the idea that something, anything might help. That if they burned enough herbs, prayed enough prayers, or shed enough blood, they might yet see the morning without sickness. But the plague was merciless, and as it ignored the cures of the wise and the faith of the desperate, people began to realize a terrible truth. They were powerless. If the plague devoured bodies, it also consumed trust. The bonds that once tied neighbours, families, and entire communities together began to fray under the weight of suspicion and grief. The world of medieval Europe was not only one of suffering, it was one of fear turned inward. In villages, old customs of hospitality began to wither. Where once a traveller might have been welcomed with bread and ale, now they were met with closed doors and hostile stares. Strangers were dangerous. Outsiders, many believed, carried the seeds of death. A cough in the street, the faint sound of retching from a house, these became signals to scatter, to shun, to flee. Even within families, fear crept like a shadow. Parents abandoned sick children in their beds, unable to bear the thought of being infected themselves. Husbands left wives, wives left husbands. Brothers locked doors against their sisters. Chroniclers of the time wrote with horror that love itself seemed to vanish in the plague years. Death was no longer shared. It was endured alone. But the fear did not remain nameless. People sought scapegoats. Whispers began that the plague was no accident, no natural scourge, but an act of malice. Rumours spread that certain groups had poisoned wells or spread powders in the streets, and as rumours grew, so too did violence. Jewish communities, already isolated by centuries of prejudice, were among the first to be accused. In towns across Germany, Switzerland and France, mobs descended upon Jewish quarters. Entire communities were wiped out in acts of slaughter and fire. In Strasbourg in 1349, hundreds of Jews were burned alive in the town square. The plague spared no one, but fear gave people a target, and blood gave them the illusion of control. Leper colonies too felt the wrath of suspicion. Lepers were thought to carry corruption in their skin, and many were driven from their shelters, hunted and killed. Beggars, foreigners, and travelling merchants, all were looked upon with narrowed eyes. Any difference, any sign of otherness, was enough to brand someone guilty. Even the wealthy were not immune from suspicion. Nobles who secluded themselves in distant estates were rumoured to be hiding secret knowledge, hoarding remedies that might save others. Clergy who continued to collect tithes were accused of greed, their wealth seen as a sign of sin. In many places, priests themselves were among the first to die, for they tended the sick and administered last rites. When the clergy fell, the faithful began to lose not only trust in their neighbours, but trust in the church itself. And yet, in the midst of suspicion, there were rare acts of courage. Some priests stayed in their parishes until the very end, ministering to the dying. Some families, despite the terror, refused to abandon one another, but these moments, though powerful, were outnumbered by silence and betrayal. The social order itself began to tilt. Labourers died in such numbers that fields went untilled. Markets stood half empty. Villages shrank into shadows of themselves. Survivors, though few, found themselves with unexpected bargaining power. Wages rose, and peasants began to demand freedoms once unthinkable. The plague tore apart not only bodies, but also the old balance of wealth and power. The world was being remade in suffering. This upheaval carried with it a strange, haunting truth. The plague was not just a disease. It was a mirror. It showed people not only their fear of death, but their fear of each other. It revealed how quickly trust could vanish, how swiftly love could falter, and how deep the human instinct for survival could cut. For those who lived through it, the world was never the same. Communities shattered, rebuilt, and changed. But the memory of betrayal lingered like a scar, and as the plague rolled on, consuming town after town, people were forced to ask themselves a question more terrifying than death. If the bonds of love and trust could break so easily, what would be left when the plague was gone? In an age when faith was the anchor of daily life, the Black Death struck at more than flesh and bone. It struck at the soul. For medieval Europe, where the church stood at the centre of existence, the plague forced people to ask questions that had no comforting answers. At first, the faithful turned instinctively to God. The bells of churches rang out more often than ever before, summoning people to prayer. Monasteries filled with the low chants of monks begging for mercy. Priests walked through towns with holy relics raised high, invoking divine protection. In villages, processions wound through the streets, barefoot penitents, men and women alike, beating their backs bloody with whips, their cries echoing against the stone walls. They believed that the plague was God's punishment, and only through suffering could forgiveness be won. But the plague did not relent. Despite endless prayers, despite endless blood, it continued to claim the innocent and the devout, just as it claimed the sinful. A child who had never spoken a lie could fall just as swiftly as a thief. A nun who had spent her life in prayer could die just as violently as a drunkard in the tavern. For many, this was the most frightening truth of all. As bodies piled higher, trust in the church began to waver. Priests who had once seemed untouchable died in such numbers that entire parishes were left without spiritual leaders. Monks locked in cloisters succumbed as quickly as farmers in the fields. Some clergy abandoned their flocks altogether, fleeing to the countryside in desperate hope of escape. To the people left behind, this desertion was a betrayal proof that even the shepherds of Christ could be undone by fear. Others, however, rose to the challenge. Stories spread of priests who stayed until their final breath, offering last rites even as they themselves were coughing and fevered. Some buried the dead when no one else dared to. These figures became quiet saints of the plague years, though most of their names were forgotten, lost in the tide of history. The theological debate deepened. Was the plague punishment for humanity's sins? Was it a test of faith? Or was it simply a mystery, a reminder that God's will could not be understood? Some preachers thundered that greed, lust, and pride had brought the wrath of heaven. Others whispered that perhaps the devil himself had been loosed upon the earth. Among the people, doubt crept in like a shadow. Some began to question the church's power. If prayers, relics, and sacraments could not hold back death, then what did they truly mean? For a society where religion had been certainty, the plague made faith fragile. And yet, even in doubt, faith did not vanish. It changed. For some, the plague deepened devotion, driving them to ever greater acts of penance. For others, it cracked the foundation of trust in the church, opening a path toward questioning authority seeds that, in centuries to come, would grow into reform. At the same time, mystical and popular beliefs surged. Pilgrimages increased, as the desperate sought holy ground where God's mercy might be stronger. Visionaries claimed to see angels and demons in the streets. Stories spread of miracles of small villages spared when a saint's relic was displayed, or of individuals who recovered after touching holy water. Whether true or not, these tales gave hope where little else could. The plague years then were not only about sickness, they were about faith under trial, faith that fractured, faith that endured, and faith that transformed. The Black Death did not kill belief, but it remade it. And for those who survived, the question lingered: had they been spared by chance, by medicine, or by God's hand? No answer came, only silence, broken by the toll of the church bells and the hollow prayers of the living who knelt among the graves of the dead. The worst has passed, though smaller outbreaks will return for generations to come. Now, in the gentle silence that follows the storm, survivors emerge to discover a world transformed beyond recognition. Imagine walking through a European town on a spring morning in this new world. The streets, once crowded with the press of humanity, now feel spacious, almost empty. The houses that line these streets tell stories. In their silence some stand empty, their shutters closed, awaiting inhabitants who will never return. Others show signs of new life, smoke rising from chimneys, children's voices drifting through open doors, gardens being tended by hands that have inherited work from these who died. The air itself feels different somehow, cleaner perhaps, with fewer people crowding into spaces designed for populations that no longer exist. The church bells still ring, marking the hours as they always have, but now they ring for congregations diminished by half or more, calling the living to prayer with tones that seem to echo through emptiness where crowds once gathered. In the gentle morning light, picture the survivors taking stock of their changed world with a mixture of grief, relief, and a growing awareness that everything they once knew has been fundamentally altered. Europe has lost between 30 and 60% of its population, somewhere between 75 and 200 million people dead within just a few years. The numbers are so vast they lose meaning, but each number represents a person, a mother, a father, a child, a craftsman, a priest, a farmer, whose life ended too soon and whose absence reshapes the world that continues without them. Yet those who survived, whether through luck, inherent resistance, previous exposure to less virulent strains, or reasons no one will understand for centuries, now find themselves in a world of unexpected possibilities. The survivors are, by definition, the strong, the fortunate, the resilient. They have witnessed horrors that would break many spirits, yet here they stand, ready to continue the eternal human project of creating life and meaning from whatever circumstances existence provides. Picture a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, who has survived while both her parents, 2 siblings, and her husband died. She stands now in what was her father's house, alone except for one surviving child, looking around at a world that seems simultaneously familiar and utterly strange. The furniture remains, the walls stand solid, the hearth still draws smoke upward as it always has. But the people who made this house a home are gone, and she must somehow create a new life from the remnants of her old one. One of the first and most profound changes survivors notice is the transformation in the basic economics of work and survival. Picture the countryside after the plague, where vast fields that once required dozens of workers to cultivate now stand partially abandoned for lack of hands to work them. The labour that once seemed abundant, with more workers than available work, has suddenly become the scarcest and most valuable resource in Europe. For peasants who survived, this scarcity creates opportunities that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Picture a peasant farmer named Thomas, who before the plague worked his lord's land 3 days a week as required by feudal obligation, receiving in return the right to farm a small plot for his family's subsistence. His father and grandfather worked under identical arrangements, accepting their place in a social order that seemed as permanent as the seasons. But now, in this transformed world, Thomas discovers that he possesses something his lord desperately needs: the ability to work the land. The lord's fields, which once had waiting lists of peasants hoping for tenancy, now lie fallow because there simply aren't enough people to cultivate them. When Thomas approaches his lord to discuss the terms of his continued labour, he does so from a position of strength unprecedented in his family's history. Imagine the negotiation that unfolds in the manor hall, a conversation that would have been impossible in the world before plague. Thomas speaks carefully but firmly. He will continue to work the land, but no longer for 3 days of obligatory service per week. Instead, he proposes working for wages actual coins that will allow him to purchase his own land, to make decisions about his family's future, and to participate in an economy that recognizes his labour's true value. The lord, desperate to maintain agricultural production on estates that have lost half their workers, agrees to terms that would have seemed outrageous just 5 years earlier. Picture Thomas leaving the manor with a wage agreement in hand, his steps lighter despite his grief for all he has lost, because he understands that something fundamental has shifted in the ancient relationship between those who own land and those who work it. Across Europe, similar negotiations unfold as survivors leverage their scarcity into improved conditions. Picture village after village where peasants demand and receive concessions that chip away at the foundations of feudal society. The right to leave one lord's service for another who offers better terms, the conversion of labour obligations into cash rents, the ability to inherit tenancies that were previously granted at a lord's pleasure, even the complete freedom from feudal bonds that had tied families to specific lands for generations. Some lords resist these changes, attempting to enforce old obligations through law and force. Picture the English Parliament passing the Statute of Labourers in 1351, desperately trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent workers from seeking better opportunities. But economic reality proves stronger than the legal mandate. Workers who know their scarcity gives them power simply move to areas where lords are willing to pay market rates, and lords who insist on old arrangements find their fields uncultivated and their estates declining. In some regions, resistance to these changes erupts into violent peasant rebellions like the French Jacquerie of 1358 or the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, where frustrated workers demand immediate transformation of social orders that resist inevitable change. Picture these uprisings as painful births of new social arrangements, violent expressions of tensions between a dying world and one struggling to be born. But whether through negotiation or conflict, the direction of change remains clear. The rigid feudal hierarchies that structured medieval society before the plague are dissolving, replaced by more fluid arrangements where labour receives compensation closer to its actual economic value, and workers possess mobility and rights that would have seemed impossible in the crowded world before death thinned the ranks of humanity. The labour shortage creates particular opportunities for women survivors who find themselves able to step into roles previously reserved for men. Picture a widow named Margaret who, before the plague, was expected to remarry quickly after her husband's death, because a woman alone could not manage a farm or business. But in this new world, where capable hands of any gender are desperately needed, Margaret discovers she can not only manage her late husband's blacksmith shop, but expand it, hiring workers, negotiating contracts, participating in commercial life in ways that social custom would have prevented in the overcrowded world before. Women enter guilds that once excluded them, take on apprenticeships in trades that were considered masculine territory, inherit property without pressure to immediately transfer it to male relatives. Picture workshops and fields where women's labour is valued not from charity but from necessity, creating precedents that, while they may not survive intact as populations recover, plant seeds of possibility for future generations. Even in marriages that form after the plague, the terms often reflect women's enhanced economic position. Picture marriage negotiations where brides or their families demand better settlements, knowing that eligible women are as scarce as eligible men, and that their labour and reproductive capacity have market value in a world desperate to rebuild its depleted population. In towns and cities, the plague's aftermath creates similar transformations. Picture a city like Florence, which lost perhaps 60% of its population, now struggling to maintain urban services and economic activity with drastically reduced numbers. The guilds that once controlled entry into skilled trades through strict apprenticeship systems and family connections find they must lower barriers to attract enough workers to keep their industries functioning. Young people who would have faced years of apprenticeship before being allowed to practice their trades independently now find themselves promoted rapidly to positions of responsibility. Picture a young carpenter named Giovanni, barely 20 years old, who finds himself running his master's workshop because the master and his 2 sons have gone to war. Adult sons all died within a week. Giovanni's skills are not yet fully developed, but he is alive, capable of learning, and the city needs furniture, doors, roof beams, all the wooden infrastructure of urban life that doesn't stop being necessary just because the people who made it have died. The opportunities extend beyond individual advancement to collective organisation. Picture workers in various trades forming new guilds or demanding voice in existing ones, using their labour power to negotiate for better conditions, fairer wages, and greater say in the economic life of their cities. The balance of power between capital and labour, which in the pre-plague world overwhelmingly favoured employers, shifts towards something more equitable, as workers understand that their scarcity gives them leverage their grandparents never possessed. In the countryside, the labour shortage forces innovation in agricultural practices that will transform European farming for centuries to come. Picture a lord looking at vast estates that once employed 100 workers, but now must make do with 30 or 40. Traditional labour-intensive methods of cultivation become impossible, forcing experimentation with different approaches. Some landowners convert arable land to pasture, recognising that sheep raising requires far fewer workers than grain cultivation, while still producing valuable wool for textile industries. Picture fields that once rippled with wheat, now dotted with grazing sheep, each animal representing an adaptation to the new economics of labour scarcity. Others consolidate holdings abandoning marginal lands that barely produced enough to justify cultivation even when labour was abundant, focusing instead on the most productive fields where reduced workforces can still generate adequate returns. Picture landscapes being reshaped as nature reclaims fields at the edges of cultivation, while more productive areas receive increased attention and investment. The peasants who remain on the land often negotiate for larger holdings, understanding that lords desperate to keep any cultivation going will grant more generous terms than they would have considered before plague thinned the labour force. Picture a peasant family that once farmed 10 acres, now working 40 or 50, producing more than they need for subsistence and selling surplus in markets that pay prices elevated by general shortages of agricultural goods. The economic transformations extend to prices and purchasing power in ways that reshape daily life for survivors. Picture markets in the years immediately following the plague, where the mathematics of supply and demand create seemingly paradoxical results. Labour commands higher wages, but grain and other agricultural products become more expensive as reduced cultivation creates shortages. For workers whose wages have risen dramatically, the net effect is often beneficial despite higher food costs. Picture a skilled craftsman who before the plague earned barely enough to feed his family and pay rent, now receiving wages that allow for modest luxuries, better quality clothing, occasional meat on the table, perhaps even savings that can be passed to the next generation. The rising wages create what economists call a golden age of the labourer, a period when the relationship between wages and prices favours workers in ways that will not be seen again until the industrial age creates similar transformations in labour markets. Picture a working family experiencing a standard of living their grandparents would have considered appropriate only for minor gentry, understanding that this prosperity arises directly from the terrible losses that created labour scarcity. Paradoxically, the plague's devastation creates conditions for remarkable cultural flourishing. Picture the generation that comes of age in plague's aftermath, inheriting wealth concentrated by mass death, living in a world where traditional authorities have been discredited by their inability to prevent or explain catastrophe, freed from some of the rigid social constraints that characterized pre-plague society. This generation produces the early Renaissance, the explosion of art, literature, architecture, and learning that transforms European culture. Picture wealthy merchants in Italian cities, their fortunes made in the economic chaos following plague, commissioning art that celebrates human achievement and beauty rather than dwelling exclusively on mortality and divine judgment. The questioning of traditional authority extends to intellectual life. Picture scholars and students at universities depleted by plague deaths, now questioning received wisdom that failed to predict or prevent catastrophe. The seeds of scientific method, of empirical observation, of doubt as a productive intellectual stance, are planted in soil fertilized by the failures of traditional knowledge to comprehend or control the plague. Artists develop new techniques and subjects, moving beyond exclusively religious themes to celebrate the everyday world and human experience. Picture painters experimenting with perspective, with realistic portrayal of human bodies and emotions, with secular subjects that would have been considered inappropriate in the more rigid cultural world before plague disrupted traditional hierarchies and assumptions. The plague's impact on religious life proves equally profound and complex. Picture churches and monasteries across Europe, their ranks depleted by plague deaths that killed clergy at even higher rates than laity, because religious obligations required them to attend the sick and dying. The survivors face profound questions about faith tested and sometimes broken by catastrophe that seem to reveal either divine cruelty or divine absence. Some respond with intensified devotion, understanding plague as divine punishment requiring deeper repentance and more fervent faith. Picture new religious movements arising in plague's aftermath, the flagellants who whip themselves in public penance, the mystics who seek direct experience of the divine without clerical intermediation, the reformers who argue that institutional corruption invited divine wrath. Others develop more skeptical or humanistic religious sensibilities, maintaining faith in God while questioning church authority and traditional interpretations of divine will. Picture lay people reading scripture in vernacular languages, forming religious study groups independent of clergy, demanding reforms in church practices that seemed inadequate to crisis, planting seeds that will eventually flower in Protestant Reformation. The church itself, weakened by loss of clergy and facing questions about its authority, must adapt to survive. Picture bishops ordaining priests with less training than would have been required before plague, monasteries accepting novices from social classes once excluded, religious institutions becoming more accessible and less exclusively controlled by traditional elites. Despite economic opportunities and cultural flourishing, survivors live with trauma that shapes their worldview for decades. Picture a woman named Catherine, successful in business, raising children born after the plague, seemingly recovered from losses that once seemed insurmountable. Yet every time someone falls ill with fever, every time she hears of deaths in a neighbouring town, every time rumours of plague's return circulate, she feels again the terror of those years when death seemed to lurk in every touch, every breath, every moment of human contact. The art and literature of the post-plague period reflects this persistent unease. Picture churches decorated with danse macabre, images of death dancing with people of every social rank, reminding viewers that mortality makes equals of king and peasant. These images aren't simply morbid fascination, but expressions of trauma that cannot be forgotten, lessons about human fragility that survivors feel compelled to preserve for generations who will not experience plague directly, but must remember its teachings. Picture also the chronicles written by survivors, their accounts mixing practical information about plague symptoms and spread with reflections on mortality, divine justice, and human suffering. These texts serve as both historical records and psychological processing, ways of making meaning from experiences that threaten to destroy all meaning, of finding lessons and patterns in catastrophe that seemed purely random and incomprehensible. In many ways, the world that emerges from the plague contains the seeds of modernity social mobility rather than fixed hierarchies, market relationships rather than traditional obligations, questioning of authority rather than automatic deference, valuing of individual life and experience rather than submission to collective destiny. Picture the grandson of a serf who died in the plague, now a prosperous merchant with his own apprentices and growing business. His grandfather could not have imagined such social mobility, could not have conceived of a world where birth did not determine destiny as surely as the seasons determine harvest. Yet here this grandson stands, proof that catastrophe, despite its horror, sometimes breaks open rigid systems and creates space for transformation. The printing press, which will arrive within a century, will find an audience shaped by plague's aftermath. Populations with higher literacy rates because labour scarcity made education more valuable, with more purchasing power to buy books, with questions about authority that create appetite for information and ideas beyond traditional sources. Picture the information revolution that follows printing as partially enabled by social transformations that plague set in motion. As gentle evening light filters through the windows of a European town in 1360, picture a family gathering for their evening meal, a mother, father, 3 children around a table that once would have held twice as many people. They eat better than peasant families ate before the plague. There is meat on the table, fresh vegetables from their own larger garden plot, bread made from good flour rather than the mixed grains that were once all they could afford. The conversation flows around the table with the comfortable intimacy of family life. Talk of the day's work, plans for tomorrow, stories that preserve memories of those who are absent but not forgotten. The children laugh at their father's jokes. The parents exchange glances that speak of shared history and mutual support. In this ordinary scene of family dinner, we see resilience not as dramatic triumph, but as simple continuation of the stubborn persistence of daily life, of love and work and hope despite everything. Picture them finishing their meal and stepping outside to enjoy the lingering twilight. Their house, their street, their town have all been touched by death and a loss. Yet here they stand, alive and creating new patterns of meaning from the fragments of the old world. Their survival is not heroic in dramatic ways, but in the quiet, persistent way that life always survives catastrophe, by continuing, by adapting, by finding in each new day reasons to hope and work and love. The Black Death reshaped Europe forever, but not only through destruction. Picture the complex legacy. Yes, millions died in circumstances of unimaginable horror. Yet their deaths also disrupted unjust systems, created opportunities for the survivors, planted seeds of social change that would eventually flower into greater human freedom and dignity. This is not to justify the suffering or claim that plague was somehow beneficial. The cost in human life and anguish far outweighs any positive consequences. But it reminds us of something important about human resilience, that even from catastrophe, survivors find ways to build meaning, create opportunity, reshape social structures toward greater justice. Picture the long arc of European history following the plague, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the gradual expansion of human rights and dignity. None of these developments can be credited solely to the plague, yet all were influenced by the social transformations that plague set in motion, the questioning of authority, the value placed on human life and labour, the understanding that social arrangements are not permanent divine orderings, but human constructions that can change. In the resilience of survivors who rebuilt lives from ruins, in the social transformations that created new possibilities from devastation, in the cultural flowering that emerged from despair, we see the eternal truth that human life persists, adapts, and sometimes even flourishes in the aftermath of catastrophe. The Black Death reshaped Europe forever, but survivors proved that death, despite its terrible power, cannot destroy the human capacity for hope, renewal, and the patient construction of meaning from whatever fragments existence leaves behind. Next time, in our closing reflection, we will return once more to the quiet European town where our journey began, to sit gently with all we have learned about suffering and survival, loss and resilience, the horror of death, and the stubborn persistence of life. Until then, let the gentle sounds of post-plague Europe children's laughter returning to empty streets, the ring of hammers rebuilding what was destroyed, the quiet conversations of families creating new futures from broken pasts, carry you into dreams that honour both the darkness we have witnessed and the light that human courage always manages to kindle, even in history's longest nights. Sleep well.